When you're not the best player in the NBA and you get offered a massive contract, you should probably take it. But these 10 guys didn't, and instead they got greedy and wanted more money. So they bet on themselves and it flopped, and they missed out on massive amounts of money, looked like a fool, and never recovered. I'll warn you, things are about to get painful, but let's take a look. So as you'll remember, in the 2010s, DeMarcus Cousins was often referred to as arguably the best center in the entire league. Even though the Kings were a terrible team, he was still the face of them for many years, putting up 27 and 12 in his best season. He was a dominant center, and even though he never carried his team to any wins, it didn't hurt his reputation too bad. Well, getting into his contract situation, he signed his first big real deal in 2013, a 4-year contract for $60 million, which was solid at that time. But then you fast forward towards the end of that contract, and a dreadful 4 years for him in Sacramento, and they finally made the move to trade him. They did the right thing, chose to move on and send him to the New Orleans Pelicans in a deal centered around Buddy Hield. And on the Pelicans, he was playing some of the best basketball of his career, and it helped that in his first full season with them, he was in a contract year. So he had that extra little bit of motivation that he was playing for a huge contract when the offseason came. So he put up career best and helped New Orleans to a winning record that saw them headed for the playoffs. But then DeMarcus Cousins tears his Achilles, the worst injury in basketball at the worst possible time for him given his contract situation. But the Pelicans did the right things, and after he got injured, they still offered him a 2-year $40 million deal, matching what he was currently making on his previous contract for the Kings. They didn't know how well he'd play when he returned, and chances were it wasn't going to be pretty, but since the injury happened on their watch, they offered him a nice deal. But with a torn Achilles, Cousins declined it, and in free agency that offseason, the Pelicans took the deal off the table, and Cousins got 0 other offers from other NBA teams, to the point where he was reaching out to teams to sign him. So he called the Warriors, and they gave him a 2-year $5 million contract. So he bet on himself, and it backfired. Extremely bad too, because he's been on 5 different teams ever since then, never played anywhere near how he used to, and to this day he's only made $13 million in NBA contracts since turning down the Pelicans' pity offer for him. So not a smart move. Victor Oladipo was in a similar situation. Now back in 2016, he signed a 4-year $85 million deal with the OKC Thunder. It was his first big contract in the NBA after getting out of his rookie deal that he had signed in Orlando. As we know, he gets traded to the Pacers and becomes their go-to guy out of nowhere. He's the star of their young team and was thought to be their superstar of the future. Well, in January of 2018, he ruptures a quad tendon in his right knee. And despite this, while he was injured, the Pacers offered Victor a $112 million contract over 4 years, which would have paid him $25 million in the first year. Well, he turned it down and would go on to miss a total of 371 days with that injury before getting traded to the Houston Rockets, who then offered him a 2-year $45 million contract, the most they could possibly offer him at the time. Well, he turned that down too, so they traded him to the Miami Heat, where he came back and only played 4 games before getting injured again. And then the season ended, and so did that initial contract with Indiana. So in 2021, he signed a 1-year $4 million contract. Like, I maybe get turning down 1 big deal, but 2, that's when I definitely don't feel bad. He could have made $20 million this season, had his future secured, but instead he made $4 million, and the future's not looking good. Now let's take things back a little bit to remember former Timberwolves player Joe Smith, where things get even more embarrassing. And I talked about him in a recent video, but we didn't get the full story. So here it is. Joe Smith was a former first overall pick in the 1995 NBA draft and played great for the Warriors. So they offered him an $80 million contract extension, and shockingly he rejected it. Especially for back then, in NBA terms, that was still big money. So they traded him to the Philadelphia 76ers, and he stayed there until he hit free agency. And once he did, he shocked everyone and signed a league minimum $1.75 million contract with the Timberwolves. The former #1 overall pick, who was playing great, signed a league minimum contract instead of an $80 million extension. And the idea here for him was that they had an under the table agreement for him to sign small contracts like this for 3 seasons. Then when they had his bird rights, they would sign him to a huge $86 million contract that would allow the Wolves to go over the salary cap. But that was only $6 million more than what the Warriors offer was, so I really don't know what this man was doing. And neither did he, because the league found out about it and voided Joe Smith's contract altogether. So he went from signing an $80 million deal and instead only made $1.7 million. And the sad part is, for the rest of his entire 16-year career after that, he only made $60 million. Brandon Jennings has another unfortunate story, which shows why you should always think twice before turning down big money. Now, originally he was drafted by the Milwaukee Bucks, and he had a great start to his career. He was a real solid scorer who averaged about 28 games. So Milwaukee offered him a 4-year $40 million deal, which was going to be his first big contract. But he wanted to play for the Pistons, so he turned it down and instead took a 3-year $25 million deal instead. And it wasn't a terrible decision. He took a lot less money, but he got to play where he wanted to. The only thing is that he couldn't have predicted that he would tear his Achilles in his 2nd year in Detroit, which he did. And from that point on, he was never the same again. He never averaged double digits in scoring after that, and only played 3 more seasons in the league, signing league minimum deals on all of them. And in total, he only made $40 million for his career. Of course, it's still a lot of money, but looking back at the circumstances of what happened, it's hard to not think about and kinda cringe. The most recent cases of a player rejecting a contract that they definitely should have taken is Dennis Schroder, and this one may be the most painful. So he wins 6th Man of the Year for the Oklahoma City Thunder in what was one of the best seasons of his career, then gets traded to the Los Angeles Lakers in his contract year and plays so good for them, they reach out and offer him a 4-year, $84 million contract, which would play him about $21 million a year. $21 million for a guy that came off the bench for most of his career. He turned it down because he reportedly wanted a $100 million deal from someone in the offseason, but instead only got a 1-year contract for $6 million from the Celtics. And that's just sad, but that makes you think that if Schroder doesn't turn down that contract, the Lakers never land a Russell Westbrook, which probably would have been best case scenario for them. But as for Dennis, it was the worst case scenario because not only did he not redeem himself this season, but he had a subpar time with Boston, so got traded to Houston and has averaged a career low 10 points and 6 assists a game. Looking now like he might even be on pace to signing for a league minimum deal next year. And it's tough because that's the largest amount of money lost by an NBA player for turning down a contract. And no matter who you are, he will never not regret that. Former NBA player Bonzi Wells can relate. He played on and off as a starter for the first 7 years of his career, averaging about 13 points and 6 rebounds a game over that time. Well, then he lands on the Kings on a 1-year deal and the playoffs come around. And after being nothing more than an average playoff performer his entire time in the league, he puts up 23 and 12 in the 2006 postseason. So the Kings see that as a glimpse of hope for him and offer him a 5-year, $36 million contract. By far the biggest ever offered to him, but he turns it down in hopes of getting more money. And why would he even do that? He only averaged those stats over a 6-game stretch, and he knew how good he was. He knew that it was a fluke for him playing that well, or at least he should have, because afterwards he only ended up signing a 2-year, $5 million contract. And not only did he never get that kind of money again, that 2-year deal was the last contract he would ever sign before finding his way out of the NBA. So he lost out on $30 million because honestly, he got kind of greedy. And speaking of role players, that brings us to Shabazz Muhammad, who tried to bet on himself, but it backfired. He got drafted to the Timberwolves in 2013, and by 2017 they offered him a 4-year, $40 million deal coming off of his rookie contract. Well, he turned it down because he thought he had such a good season that he could get better money in free agency. And I don't know why he'd think that, because he averaged 9 points, 3 rebounds, and 0.4 assists a game, and everyone else wanted the same, especially after he got no other offers in free agency. So he went back to the Wolves and asked for that deal back, but by that point they were only able to give him a minimum contract. So sadly he accepted it, fell out of the team's rotation, got traded to the Bucks halfway through the year, then never played another NBA game again. Now he's been playing overseas ever since, and I don't know what to say besides that just hurts. Now with Donatas Motiejunas, he's the one guy that I don't even blame for how his contract situation turned out. So in the early 2010s, he came into the league and spent 4 years playing for the Houston Rockets as a bench player, and he was a decent stretch forward. And even the Nets saw that, so he signed a 4-year, $37 million offer sheet with them in free agency. But the Rockets matched that offer, so he was forced to stay with them. But then Houston told him that $31 million of his deal would be his base salary, and the other $6 million would be incentives. So basically they were only going to pay him $31 million. Well, he protested it, and even though they were still going to pay him $31 million, he skipped training camp and sat out games until eventually the Rockets renounced his contract months later. Well, then after that, his only option was to sign a $1.5 million league minimum contract for the Pelicans, which sadly would be his last NBA contract ever. And I gotta say, I don't blame him for sitting out. It was pretty messed up by the Rockets to cost him $6 million and just say they weren't gonna pay it to him. And I don't know all the technicalities behind that, but I feel like this is something maybe the league should have stepped in on. Then we have one of the most popular cases and a current day player that this happened to in Nerlens Noel. Now, Noel was a near superstar player in college, which was why he was supposed to go first overall in the NBA draft, but eventually went 6th to the Philadelphia 76ers. And he was a part of those terrible Philly teams. And even on them, he wasn't a fantastic player. He had great moments on defense, but never really averaged double digits in scoring. But even then, the Mavericks believed in him so much that they traded a couple players and a first-round pick for him. And in that offseason, they offered him a 4-year, $70 million contract, which comes out to be about $17.5 million a year. Well, he turned it down so he could take a 1-year, $4 million deal that would make him an unrestricted free agent at the end of the season, with hopes to sign a max contract somewhere. So basically, he turned down $70 million for a chance to prove that he was worthy for a max, and this man came out and put up 4 points and 5 rebounds a game and only played about half the games of that season because of injuries. Man, I can't take any more of this. I'm out.